Good afternoon. Welcome to this press conference on EU-Egypt relations. We have with us three guests today. The Standing Rapporteur of Foreign Affairs Committee for Egypt, Mr. Satouri. We have Ms. Tineke Strik, who is the Rapporteur on the External Dimension of EU Migration Policy, as well as Ms. Melchior, the Coordinator from Legal Affairs Committee. We will have, moreover, two more guests that will connect remotely. And that is Mr. El Fajeri, Egyptian human rights defender, and Ms. El Husseini, who's a program officer at the Egyptian Human Rights Forum. This press conference is in English and French. I will just give the floor first for introductory remarks to Mr. Satouri, please.
Merci, bonjour à toutes et à tous. On a l'habitude, quand on ouvre ce type de cérémonie, de dire « je suis ravi d'être parmi vous ». En fait, je ne le suis pas. J'aurais préféré qu'on n'ait pas besoin de se mobiliser à l'occasion de cette dernière séance plénière pour parler du sujet d'aujourd'hui. Nous sommes là pour discuter de ce partenariat stratégique de l'Union européenne et de l'Égypte annoncé par la Commission. La Commission prévoit de verser 7,4 milliards d'euros à l'Égypte, 5 milliards d'assistance macroéconomique, dont 1 milliard via la procédure d'urgence, 600 millions de subventions, dont 200 millions pour la migration, objectif de 1,8 milliard d'investissements et de co-investissements par les partenaires financiers. Or, le Conseil, qui a validé ce paquet, demande de manière assez solennelle, et je m'en réjouis, à la Commission de prendre toutes les mesures concrètes, précises, pour respecter les mécanismes démocratiques efficaces, l'état de droit et pour garantir le respect du droit humain. Nous sommes ce matin venus pour rappeler cette obligation à Mme Ursula von der Leyen et à la Commission. Il n'existe, selon nous, aucun calendrier pour la mise en œuvre des réformes par l'Égypte. Les indicateurs ne sont ni concrets ni crédibles. Et enfin, il n'y a, de notre point de vue, aucune évaluation précise sur la situation égyptienne. L'actualité le démontre, les droits humains sont violés quotidiennement en Égypte. Hier, 15 femmes et 3 hommes ont été arrêtés devant les bureaux des Nations Unies pour une simple pétition sur la situation à Gaza et au Soudan. Les conditionnalités qui doivent être incluses dans le paquet sont pour nous cruciales et doivent être précises. Nous en proposons quelques-unes à la Commission. Lever la censure sur les médias indépendants, libérer les 60 000 prisonniers politiques, stopper la pression sur la société civile et sur les opposants et protéger l'égalité des sexes, le droit des minorités et des migrants et des réfugiés. Voici quelques pistes concrètes qui peuvent, de notre point de vue, à notre sens, redonner un sens aux principes et aux valeurs européennes et éviter que durant cette législature, Mme Ursula von der Leyen fasse de l'Union européenne une banque de financement des régimes autoritaires et des dictatures. Voyez qu'on est précis, on est ferme et on souhaite qu'il y ait une réponse concrète de la part de la Commission européenne et de Mme von der Leyen. Et je suis ravi de donner la parole à mes collègues engagés depuis le début sur ce sujet, sur le respect des valeurs européennes.
Please, Ms. Strik, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to this press conference. And indeed, this is not the first so-called migration deal that the EU is concluding with a third country, and also not the first time that it's with a dictatorial regime. And because of the focus of the EU on migration is moving more and more towards the outside world of the EU, to third country, in order to stop irregular migration into the EU. I made a report which was adopted already 3 years ago about how to deal with this cooperation on migration. And in that report, which the European Parliament adopted, we called for a fundamental rights impact assessment before we enter into a cooperation to make sure that the impact of such a cooperation is not detrimental to the human rights of migrants and refugees, that there's an independent monitoring system, that there's democratic control, and that people can go to a court if they are affected, if their rights are affected, if they don't get access to protection. And also we said there should be much more transparency, and the money that goes into that cooperation should also be under democratic control. Now, my colleague Muni already showed that this is far from the case with Egypt. But talking about the human rights impact for migrants and refugees in Egypt, we know Egypt doesn't have an asylum system at all. We see that refugees who cross the border and enter into Egypt, like a lot of Sudanese refugees, are deported back immediately into Sudan. Or if they're not deported, they're completely abandoned. They don't have access to any basic needs. Even those who manage to go to UNHCR, because UNHCR is active in the country, if they manage to register, if they even manage to get protection, they don't have access to a health system, to an education system, and they can be deported at any moment. So Egypt does not recognize the work that UNHCR does and doesn't safeguard the protection and the safety of the refugees. So refugees and migrants face systemic barriers into their access to protection and are subject to arbitrary arrest and deportation. And you cannot disconnect this to the autocracy that Egypt has become under the regime of Sisi. There are now 70,000 political prisoners, but also the work of NGOs, lawyers, journalists has completely been made impossible. And we have seen in Tunisia what this also means for people working and advocating for the rights for refugees and migrants. They hardly can do their job. They cannot express criticism. And also after the deal with Tunisia, we see that only more people have been deported into the desert and are arrested by the Tunisian regime. So doing these deals with a dictatorship, with an autocrat, means de facto, and we really see it every time, that the rights are actually more under pressure, because it leads to more repression, because the country says, I don't want to be responsible for all of them. And it leads to more repression on all those people, actors who try to protect refugees and migrants. And we don't hear criticism because the people are not allowed to express the criticism. So that also shows us, if we learn from Tunisia, that it's very dangerous to enter in such the same deal now with Egypt. And it does not only lead to more human rights violations and more oppression, but it doesn't even stop irregular migration, because people are not safe in Egypt. And they will need to flee, to keep on fleeing the suppression in Egypt. And we see that also with Tunisia. It actually leads to more people fleeing and looking for protection in Europe. And not only third country nationals, refugees, but even Tunisians, because of the oppression. And I'm sure that we will see a repetition of this story with this new deal. Thank you. I will hand over to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Ms. Melchior, please.
Thank you very much. Both Tina and Munir has underlined the simple demands that we as a European Parliament have to the Commission and the Member States. If we want to go into partnerships with third countries, we don't give them a blank check. If we go into a partnership with a dictatorship, we don't give the money to the dictator and say you can do whatever you please. We talk to the civil society, we talk to, for example, UN organizations. Perhaps we give the money to the UNHCR in Egypt rather than giving it to the Egyptian government. We have a report that Trine did 3 years ago on how to do migration partnerships. All of this is being ignored by the Council and by the Commission. They are not using the legislative procedures, the consultation procedures that they should with the European Parliament, because they want to ignore what we have to say, which is quite reasonable. Simple respect of fundamental rights and respect of refugees. This is being ignored, and that's why they do emergency procedures and press conferences with heads of state and strongmen in third countries. This is why this Parliament needs to take these agreements seriously. It's part of the election campaign for the European elections for Ursula von der Leyen wanting to be supported by the far right. We need to look at the roles of the institutions. We need to insist on the role of the Parliament needs to be included, and the Commission cannot circumvent our rules of procedure between the institutions, cannot circumvent the checks and balances that we have in the EU just because it is politically useful. We have decided in this Parliament a couple of months ago to start a case against the Commission for giving a blank check to Orban. We should start a case against the Commission for giving blank checks to dictators in third countries.
Thank you very much. We will be now joining our guests that are joining remotely. I'm giving the floor to Mr. El-Fajeri from Human Rights. Mr. El-Fajeri, are you with us? Please.
Yes, you hear me now. I thank the distinguished member of the European Parliament who organized and participated in this conference. We appreciate the role played by this Parliament over the past years on several occasions to support the rights of the Egyptian people and the human rights movement struggle for justice and freedom. I will start with the title of this conference, Strategic Partnership for Who? Suppose the long-term goal of the EU-Egypt strategic and comprehensive partnership is to achieve shared prosperity, stability, and security. In that case, the fundamental criteria of respect for human rights and the rule of law should clearly and transparently guide its implementation in close consultation with the genuine civil society and the human rights defender. It is, however, disappointing that we have been observing the formal position and narrative of the EU towards the crisis of human rights in Egypt have become weak and inconsistent since the convening of the Association Council meeting with Egypt in July 2017 and up to the latest Association Council held in January this year. This narrative, unfortunately, overestimates the impact of the limited and tactical concessions taken by the Egyptian authorities since late 2020 to improve its international image and manage to secure more support to save the ailing economy from collapse. However, there is solid evidence that the political landscape of human rights continues to be severely restricted and intimidating. Egypt continues to be a republic of fear. There are still thousands of imprisoned political activists and human rights defenders. Travel ban orders and asset freeze continue to be used as weapons against dissenters. For years, the flagrant and ironic use of counter-terrorism measures and listing against peaceful activists, lawyers, and human rights defenders have not stopped. The conditions of prison and detention centers are appalling and cause occasional death of several detainees and prisoners. The civil space is completely controlled by the state and its security and intelligence agencies whose intrusive powers engineer the constitutional and representative institutions, including the latest sham and uncompetitive presidential election held in December last year. Independent human rights defenders and NGOs cannot work freely inside Egypt. Free and critical NGOs cannot register under the draconian NGO law without being exposed to systematic intervention from the security services. A wide community of human rights defenders, political activists, and journalists continue to live in exile. However, they have been also targeted by the state in what is known as transnational repression. For example, independent human rights NGOs have documented cases of reprisal against the family of members. The government systematically denies activists from receiving consulate services and obtaining their IDs and passports, leaving them no option but to seek asylum. So Egypt export asylum seekers and irregular migrants. I should recall here that when the president of Egypt declared the National Dialogue Initiative in April 2023, thousands of activists outside and inside Egypt expressed their willingness to constructively engage with the initiative, provided that the government implement a series of reform measures to build confidence. However, most of these demands were disregarded, and the national dialogue intentionally excluded key independent voices outside and inside Egypt. To conclude, I stress that the EU should support the effort of the Egyptian human rights movement by complementing, not jeopardizing their work. Respect for human rights and the rule of law are necessary in addressing broader issues like immigration and economic crises stemming from unaccountable governance. Clear and transparent benchmarking is instrumental for the efficiency of EU partnership and Egypt. Any financial support given to Egypt should be linked and conditioned to genuine and measurable progress in the human rights landscape. At the top of this condition is the enabling environment for civil society and human rights defenders. Thank you again for providing me with this space.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Fajeri. And I would like to invite now the second speaker, Mr. Mar Al-Husseini, who's also joining us remotely. If you're there, please press the speak button.
Yes, good evening and thank you for having me. I speak to you today while a group of 15 women human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and members of the National Human Rights Councils and others were beaten and detained by the Egyptian security forces yesterday, and their whereabouts remained unknown for more than 24 hours, some of which hold dual European and Egyptian nationalities. These brave defenders were simply delivering a letter to the UN office in Cairo demanding protection and safety for women in Gaza and Sudan. This is the regime you're currently discussing giving a blank check to, an authoritarian repressive regime that had put tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience and human rights defenders behind bars, and imposed restrictions on freedom of assembly, association, protest, and expression. You cannot keep pouring water into an empty pot and expect change. The current regime is broken and its practices are draconian and rigorous. Your constant, unconditional support is only enabling it. As this deal moves forward, we remind you of your commitment towards promoting democracy and human rights. Upholding human rights should be a cornerstone for any strategic partnership. We urge you to have a clear, time-bound benchmarks for advancing human rights situation in Egypt in the Memorandum of Understanding. The deal in front of us focuses on the prevention aspect of migration without providing adequate protection tools for migrants and refugees in Egypt, especially in light of the recent attacks on Sudanese communities and the current war profiteer situation on Rafah's borders. We urge you also to include the following benchmarks in the MOU: releasing all arbitrarily detained human rights defenders and political activists, lifting restrictions on freedom of assembly and independent media, opening political and civic space in preparation for the upcoming parliamentary elections in 2025, establishing protection tools for migrants and refugees from intimidation, harassment, and other forms of exploitation, and preventing forms of transnational repression practices against human rights defenders. All these demands and more must be at the forefront of this discussion. This regime's actions speaks louder than their words, and your support for this deal without clear and precise benchmarks will only encourage its repressive tactics. It's time to take a strong stand and put human rights at the center of your agenda. Thank you again for having me and for this space.
Thank you very much.